welcome to our first, as you can probably tell, Time for Action Zoom. This is going to be a weekly happening. We're hoping to unpack a lot of issues that are happening, and we just don't feel that CBC is covering them well enough. Big surprise. So I've got with me Ken Love, who's a retired lawyer who came across the bill and was so shocked that he's done a complete analysis of it. And as I said, we're trying to get Elizabeth on as a participant. So Ken, I just want to ask you first, why do we need a climate accountability bill? I mean, why does a country even bother with one?
You don't need one.
But why is it a good thing? Why are governments introducing them?
Last time I saw you people on Zoom, you had Mack Truck on, and he explained to you people all you have to do is learn how to select climate sincere politicians. If everyone did that, then you wouldn't need this bill. If you have this,
yes, but
bill,
we don't have climate sincere politicians. So why is this an issue we're dealing with right now?
Because it can help. It's not any sort of huge solution, but if it works properly, then it helps. It really moves the job of creating the climate plan, both the target and the plan. It takes that job away from elected politicians and ideally gives it to an expert advisory body. And then it makes it really hard for the elected politicians not to take the advice of the expert advisory body. Moreover, when the politicians implement the plan, there's another part of an arm's length group that evaluates. They evaluate progress on the plan. If they aren't making progress, they say that you're not going to make the next target. So this is what we think you need to do. And again, in the ideal bill, the minister has to reply to that. And if he's not going to take the advice of the advisory board, he has to say why.
Okay, so well, let's back up a bit right now. And I don't want to cover too much ground before Elizabeth gets here, but let's talk about the advisory body. Does it look strong enough the way they've got it in the bill now?
No, absolutely not. And there's two reasons for that. The first is the way it's selected, and the second is the job it's given or its mandate. Regarding the selection, and my overall message here is Liberals, read the United Kingdom Act of 2008, the Climate Change Act. Read the New Zealand one that came in 2019. They copied the UK. And in both acts, the way they do it is they make the advisory body very independent. New Zealand sets out, they appoint a selection committee to pick what we would call the advisory body. And among the things they have to do, the selection committee has to talk to all the other parties represented in Parliament. So a representative of all parties in Parliament. The point of that is you need those other guys on board, because if not, and the Conservatives form the next government, they say, well, you appointed a bunch of Liberals, we're going to ignore it. So that's the independent in terms of the selection. In terms of the work they do, you want to give them a solid mandate so that they are the group in Canada that does the heavy lifting in terms of creating the target and making the plan. And then you want it so that, in the good acts, New Zealand and United Kingdom, they both say, it's the mandate, or the advisory body, our version, shall make a plan that contains this bing, 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 bing. Then it says they shall provide that, have it tabled in Parliament, and the minister shall respond to it. And if the minister chooses not to take their advice, the minister has to explain by tabling a report in Parliament why he's not taking the advice of the advisory body. The advisory
what does this bill do or not do in terms of the advisory body?
There is established an advisory body. It really doesn't set out much beyond that. It doesn't set out much mandate at all. I mean, I suppose somebody who wants to be optimistic can say, well, it's all there to be done, but it's not. And more importantly, there's nothing saying the minister has to take the advice of the advisory body. All it says is something like the minister must publicly respond. So thanks for the advice. That's a public response. You know, and it doesn't say if the minister doesn't take the advice, that the minister must set out the reasons for not taking the advice. That's what we need. Hi, Elizabeth.
Okay, I see Elizabeth.
Hello.
Welcome, Elizabeth.
I've never had so much trouble getting into a Zoom. I apologize to participants and specifically, of course, to Kathleen and Ken and everyone who's presenting. It's very, this is of all the possible Zoom meetings that I had trouble getting into, this is the one I most want to get into. We have so much to talk about.
No,
We have so much to talk about.
Problem we're having.
Oh,
Okay.
it was bizarre. But anyway, thank you.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Well, Ken and I have just been going over the advisory body, but I'd like to back up to our original plan, which was to let you speak for about 5 minutes, just to give us a context of the bill.
Okay. Well,
so-
I'm just looking through the participants and feeling quite overawed that Seth Klein is in there watching us, and my colleague Paul Manley from Parliament. This is quite a great group, and I'm very, very keen to share with you how angry I am.
Good.
So let's start with that. We have two things that I want to try to cover in less than 5 minutes. One is that the government's so-called climate plan is not a climate plan. And secondly, that the Climate Accountability Act doesn't provide accountability. So let's back up and say what we should have at a minimum is a plan and a commitment and a target that's consistent with the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is very clear that the goal is to stay as far below 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase as possible and try to hold to 1.5 degrees. This is critical to understand. That's the Paris goal. What the media uniformly calls, which the Trudeau Liberals call our Paris target, is the target left behind by Stephen Harper in May of 2015, representing the third time that Stephen Harper weakened Canada's target. So what we have, which gets misnamed the Paris target, is the target that we happened to have in place while we were negotiating in Paris, and it then got embedded into everything. It's very weak. It's 30% below our 2005 emission levels by 2030. Now you contrast that with what the Paris Agreement calls for, which is doing everything possible to hold to 1.5 degrees. I wish I had graphics and charts and such like, but I'm just going to keep talking, and I hope people can take notes because there's a lot of figures. So what our current goal is not the Paris target. It is manifestly inconsistent, incompatible with the Paris target. Paris is about holding to 1.5. What would it take to hold to 1.5? Well, fortunately, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did that work for us and has told us what it would take to hold to 1.5. They issued a special report, October 2018, that said very clearly that holding to 1.5 is going to be extremely difficult. And the only way we're going to be able to do it is through massive Herculean efforts that, as they've put in the language of the report, requires immediate action. Now we're 26 months later from when the IPCC told us we needed immediate action, such that we do at least 45% globally reductions in carbon dioxide against 2010 levels. Let's just say, to make that easier to grasp, we have to cut about half of global emissions by 2030. So with Canada having this mealy-mouthed position of 30% below 2005 by 2030, that's not on. That doesn't reduce us. That doesn't hold us to 1.5 degrees. So back to the so-called plan, you need to know that when you dig into it, it turns out they're not even talking about starting reductions against 2005 levels. In 2005, Canada was emitting 730 megatons. That is, by the way, 21% more than we were emitting back in 1990. We've gone up. But does the Canada plan that Wilkinson just released, does it say what it says? We're going to get to 30% below 2005 levels, which is I've pointed out is about half of what we have to do. Their plan starts not at 730 megatons, they start at 815 megatons, a level we've never hit that they say is that would happen if we didn't do anything. So that's what we're reducing against. We're going to reduce 30% below 815 megatons. Okay. Now, the Climate Accountability Act itself is about changing our time horizon to the distant horizon. So instead of talking about what we have to do by 2030, and more than that, instead of grounding our action in what the IPCC says we must do in order to hold on to a level of warming which we can survive. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Will human civilization survive? And we know that every inch above 1.5 degrees Celsius increases the risk that we don't make it. So holding to 1.5, as the IPCC has told us, is not a guarantee that we can get through this with human civilization intact. But it's way safer than 2 degrees, and 2 degrees is safer than 3 degrees. If every country on Earth had Canada's target, we'd be headed to 5 degrees. So realistically, what I thought I would see in any Climate Accountability Act was, number one, carbon budgeting against actual tonnage of how much room do we have left in the atmosphere for more warming gases. We're basically out of budget within the next 7 years. I thought we would see in a Climate Accountability Act 5-year increments with budgeting starting in 2020. That's what I thought we should. If we look at the other Climate Accountability Acts around the world, things like the United Kingdom, New Zealand, within bringing in the act, their first budget periods were within 3 years and 5 years, and immediate action is required. This is a political act with the goal of being able to claim that the Liberals care about climate when they don't. I mean, that's my conclusion, and I'm disillusioned and angry because I really, forget partisanship, I really thought that they were serious about a Climate Accountability Act that would have a 2020 beginning, a 2025 benchmark. The Climate Accountability Act has its first milestone year in 2030. Wilkinson still says, and I think he actually cares about this stuff. I don't know how his advice is so bad. Maybe I'm just fooled to think he cares. But why would you pick 2030 as your first milestone year? And then why would you create an advisory body, which is in the UK and in New Zealand are expert scientific providers of advice? They're clearly providing this as a multi-stakeholder group within which labor unions can argue with oil sands and big oil and environmentalists, a multi-stakeholder group. This should be an expert panel. And the first benchmark year should be 2025. And the way to fix the legislation is to put in the benchmark year that by 2025, we will reduce 25% below 2005 levels. Almost, you could say, pick a number. Now, the Canada has already, and I know I've gone over my 5 minutes probably, but Canada, just one more quick point. We made a commitment in Paris that in 2020, calendar year 2020, we would improve our target. And we've blown by that with no accountability at all because no one in the media cares to point it out because they didn't keep track of the Paris document called the COP21 decision document, within which Canada said we will update our target in 2020 and every 5 years thereafter. So this fixation on 2030 is to put it past the political lifetime of this government, and net zero by 2050. This is the biggest fallacy. The way it's being pitched is that the IPCC is being misinterpreted, and I think deliberately, in order to create the impression that we can hold to 1.5 degrees, a livable world. If we get to net zero by 2050, we'll be fine. So we've got a 30-year planning horizon. We just have to get to net zero by 2050. No, it's very clear from the IPCC report that we blow by 1.5. The window of opportunity to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius will close well before 2030. The heavy lifting to hold to 1.5 degrees must be done in the next 5 to 6 years, not later than that. So we should count our opportunities to hold to 1.5 in months, not years. We've lost 26 months from when the IPCC said this is a screaming alarm. All governments on Earth must exert Herculean efforts. So I'll stop there. I'm very angry.
I don't blame you, Elizabeth, and I'm glad you're conveying that, because I don't think there's enough anger at this point. There's a lot of urgency, but no, not enough anger. Just going back, Ken, I just want your comments on this myth of 2050, net zero at 2050. I think, Elizabeth, in your document that you sent me, you said we've got a finish line, as you pointed out just now, of 2050, but no starting line. So do you have any comments about the myth of, or the idea of net zero emissions by 2050, Ken?
One of the things that upset me most this past year in terms of climate change is when Mr. Trudeau said, we are committed to net zero by 2050. Most of us will be dead by 2050. It doesn't matter. It matters what we do now. I agree with everything Ms. May said. If we can't make a target for 2020, which we couldn't, or any other target, we're not going to make a net zero by 2020 unless we do it in increments. And the first increment absolutely has to be 2025. I think every time, I cringe every time I hear we're committed to net zero by 2050.
It was interesting to hear Greta Thunberg and a lot of youth climate activists from within the European Union issued an open letter when the European Commission met and said the European Union as a whole is committed to 55% reductions as against 1990 levels. So I'm going to make my own graphs with my hands here. So let's say this is 1990. Canada is 21% above 1990 right now. We have increased more than any other country in the G7. The US is at 4% above 1990.
Wow.
Japan is at 3% above 1990. We're 21% above 1990. Now, the European Union just pledged to do 55% below 1990 levels and get there by 2030, because right now the EU collectively is at 24% below 1990. We're 21% above. Okay, so you get the picture. We're the worst. So even with the European Union pledging to go to 55% below 1990 levels, and many of the countries in the European Union are close to that. I mean, the UK, Germany, France, they've done big reductions. Even with that, Greta Thunberg said, net zero by 2050 is surrender. If you focus on that timeline that says you have to get to net zero by 2050, you communicate to the political class of the world that you've got 30 years. You don't. You have at most 36 months to get your act together, maybe. If we don't reduce emissions, the heavy lifting on emissions reductions must be done in this decade. We don't have even increments going out 30 years for reducing and for going off fossil fuels altogether. So how we can have a government that thinks it's appropriate to be angry at Joe Biden for canceling Keystone. We should be so ashamed that we are building Trans Mountain with public money, $17 billion of public money. And the Parliamentary Budget Office said this clearly in the last few months of 2020. Look, if the government of Canada is serious about additional climate action, you're going to lose everything. Trans Mountain makes no sense. If they're serious about net zero by 2050, you don't build Trans Mountain. So investing public money in this pipeline is betting against our own survival and disbelieving your own political promises at the same moment that you make them. I don't know how the Liberals can be so passionately committed to cognitive dissonance that they believe two things so passionately that are incompatible at the same time. We can build pipelines and we're climate leaders. No.
Well, someone said it's like saying you can eat a Big Mac while you're on a diet. You just can't. Or not too many
It's
of them.
pretty much as bad as saying you can eat a Big Mac while you're a cow.
What about, can you go just mention, before you came on, Ken was talking about the advisory committee, and you mentioned a bit about that. But there's also the Environment Commissioner, and I had to look up the name of the Environment Commissioner. He or she doesn't seem to be very effective. But what is the role of the Environment Commissioner? And I think it's a he now, an interim one.
It is. Yeah.
But what is the role of the Environment Commissioner in the bill? Is that equally empty? I'll ask Ken first.
Okay.
Yes. When you go, UK and New Zealand put both functions, the advisory function and the evaluation function, into one body. We separate it. Okay. But when there's a progress report, so right now it says 2 years before the first milestone year, progress report. In UK and New Zealand version, they have those every year. But forget about that. What they also have is that the environment, what we call the Environment Commissioner, the evaluating body, will evaluate the progress report and will, and in fact, they do it first before the minister. But one of the things they do is they evaluate the accuracy of the minister's progress report and his report afterward, after a milestone year. Then they would also say whether the minister is on target, like having evaluated the accuracy, is he doing enough? Is he on target to make the next target? If not, their one shop fit does all body, maybe our advisory body should advise on, okay, you're not making the target. This is the additional things you have to do to reach the target, achieve the target. None of that is there. What it says is the Environment Commissioner shall make a report every 5 years. It doesn't say what he's going to report on. It doesn't say, there's nothing suggesting that that 5 years is going to coincide with a progress report or even with the report afterward, after a milestone.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, the Environment Commissioner, I would say, I wouldn't want to suggest that they haven't done a great job. I think the Environment Commissioner has done very well since originally created in the early 90s and strangely enough, put inside the Office of the Auditor General. So there's been a push for many years that the Environment Commissioner should be a separate officer of Parliament with a proper budget. Right now, the Auditor General themselves, the Office of the Auditor General, doesn't have enough funding to do the job they need to do, even more so the Environment Commissioner. Now, the Environment Commissioner, the last one who was appointed full-time was Julie Gelfand. She did a fantastic job. She was holding government to account she was the Office of the Auditor General Environment Commissioner. In their last report in 2020, went back and reminded the Government of Canada this was the deadline under the promises that were made in Copenhagen, right? But because those promises were made by the federal Conservatives, the federal Liberals never took them on board. So it's become fashionable in Canada to think targets don't matter, no one meets their targets. You need to reframe that. Targets do matter. Canadians don't meet the targets, right? Within the Kyoto Protocol, virtually every industrialized country that made a commitment to the target hit their target or came very close. Japan had Fukushima happen when it was on track to reduce, and then it shut down its nukes. So that's why Japan is now above 1990 levels. It missed its Kyoto target, which was very embarrassing for Japan since Kyoto happened in Japan. But Fukushima, they had a plan, they were headed there. But every European Union nation made their targets. Australia made their target. The countries in Kyoto that took targets on hit their targets, except for Canada. And the back to the Office of the Auditor General and the Environment Commissioner, I think they've done a good job over the years. The current interim is, I think it's Andrew Hayes, is that he's basically acting in the role until they appoint someone. So why are the Liberals not appointing a new full-time person to replace Julie Gelfand? This is obviously not seen as a priority by them. But in the bill, back to why another failure of C12, the idea that the Commissioner for the Environment should produce a report every 5 years is absurd. If not every year, every 3 years, every 5 years, that's unacceptable. And again, comparing to the UK climate accountability legislation, the Danish climate accountability legislation, New Zealand climate accountability legislation, they're in those bills, they have an expertise in the advisory body that holds them to account. Again, so the combination of having a multi-stakeholder, non-expert group to create political cover and delay around any plan or new target. And I mean, by the way, it's not like the current target we have was the result of consultation. It just came right out of Stephen Harper's PMO and landed by surprise in May 2015. The failure of the Liberals to have put in place a new target after 6 years in power is appalling. At the time, Greens pushed hard that Justin Trudeau should go to Paris and there announce our new target. Instead, Catherine McKenna said, the old Harper target, that's the floor, we're going to do way better. Now when Jonathan Wilkinson says we're going to exceed our Paris target, see how cleverly it stopped being the Harper target and started being the Paris target. And then the most recent documentation Environment Canada released on December 11th, 2020, said, yes, we want to do better than the 30%. I won't call it the Paris target. We're going to do better than that. So they offer up maybe 32% or maybe as much as 40% with more provincial action and more provincial cooperation. And it needs to be said that if the federal government were serious about climate action, they have all the tools they need right now in federal law. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act, going back to 2005, listed greenhouse gases as a substance that can be regulated under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The Minister of Environment could put forward regulations for any facility in Canada to reduce emissions by X%. So they use quite a lot the fact that as a federated state, as Canada, the roles of provinces are, of course, and territories, terribly important. It's best to move forward with cooperation, absolutely. But this is a climate emergency, and we should not be putting one single dime into fossil fuel subsidies, which both John Horgan in BC is putting subsidies into fracking and fracking pipelines, and so is the federal government putting more money into subsidies in new categories. So there's less subsidy going into the oil sands with more subsidies going into fracking and fracking pipelines and fracking infrastructure like the Kitimat LNG. And at the same time, again, I'm going to repeat the number, 17 billion solely into completing the Kinder Morgan / Trans Mountain pipeline that's violating Indigenous rights and threatens to put tankers full of diluted bitumen on our shorelines here. And diluted bitumen is a substance that can't be cleaned up. But the failure of a commitment to climate action, and I would say, again, I don't understand what the NDP is doing. They've got the catbird seat in Parliament. With 3 Greens, we fight as hard as we can. Unfortunately, too many voters believe the promises from the other people, so we're just 3. If we were 12, we would be able to make a much bigger difference, but we don't have the balance of power votes. So I don't want to be partisan about this. I'm just saying, people on this call and others who can pick up a phone and call their MP if their MP is an NDPer or call Jagmeet Singh, why, after more than a year since the election, with them in a minority government position where they can bring down the government on any confidence vote, why do they never even mention climate as one of the things they care about? Sick leave, absolutely paid sick leave, all these things really matter. But for the love of God, we're in a climate emergency. So we really need to push the Liberals. We need to push the Democrats. We need to push the Bloc. The Bloc has great climate policies, and they have the votes to bring down the government. The fact that we're about, that people are, the environmental movement has already moved into the position of, okay, how do we talk to all the people on the Environment Committee and how do we get them to pass amendments to C12? It's really time to blow the whistle on the whole scam that the emperor is naked.
Well, Elizabeth, my next question was in terms of actions. Before we go to questions from the viewers, we've called this Time for Action because we don't want it to be a talk fest. So should people, okay, phone the NDP and block MPs? And I sent this invitation out to all the Liberals, even if they don't come, at least they know things are happening.
Yeah.
And I also called it the net zero accountability bill on purpose, because that's about how much accountability there is. But what about going, should we be bothering with the Environment Committee, or, you know, what? Ken, let's start. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll
Go
just
ahead. No,
ask. Yeah. Ken, have you got any talk? Or you've been dealing with Lead Now, I understand.
Lead Now has, Ken Love was the reason he did a 40-minute video. He was trying to convince Lead Now to take action, and just a couple of days ago, suddenly it appeared in the inbox is Lead Now has a petition for strengthening C12 that we'll provide a link for in the chat.
Oh, good, good. And Ken Love.
My video.
Pardon?
Provide a link to my video.
Buy it?
You asked
Yeah.
what I think we should do. And this is me. I'm not talking for Lead Now. I'm certainly not talking for CCL. I found C12 offensive. I think it's a national disgrace when you look at
Yes.
the UK and New Zealand. And I think it's probably the second most cynical thing I've seen from the Liberals, and the most inexcusable. The first being, you know, first past the post, this will be our last election. But this was calculated. You have to work hard to make a bill that mentions all the right phrases without doing anything. So I highlighted what I saw as the top 4 problems with it, and it's difficult because I think there's about 6 or 7 at least. But you know, and then I'm saying the main battle should be fought by, you know, everyone on this call your MP and try to get a Zoom meeting. If you can't get a Zoom meeting, get a telephone call. If you can't get that, send an email before the end of January. And the things I've identified is 2025, not 2030, 2025. Second, make the advisory body independent, have it selected independently, not by the minister. Third, increase the mandate of that advisory body so that they're the ones who do all the heavy lifting on the plan. Make it very difficult for the minister not to follow their advice. Set it out that if the minister chooses not to adopt the plan set by the advisory body, he has to explain in Parliament why not. And then finally, give a solid mandate. Ms. May said she likes the Environment Commissioner. I do too. I think they do good work, but they have no mandate here.
Right.
You know, they specifically have to evaluate the accuracy of the progress report and then the report after the milestone year. Are they going to make it? Are they on track to make the target or not? And then somebody between the advisory body and the Environment Commissioner has to say, well, you're not on target, and this is what you need to do to get back on target. And by the way, you got to respond to that.
Elizabeth, thank you.
Well, I thank Seth for putting in the chat the 350.org petition. It's good, but again, okay, let me just get back to the kind of actions. Yes, sign all the petitions in the world. It's very clear that the Liberals promised a Just Transition Act. That's one of the things that the Just Transition Act should be a separate piece of legislation and should have been brought out by now. It was, of course, COVID legitimately has thrown off promises, but Prime Minister Trudeau promised a Just Transition Act in the election. We haven't seen anything or heard anything about it since. So again, looking at legislation like this piece of legislation, you can't look at it in a void. You have to look at what is the government planning overall on its climate target. And we have been phobic about targets. I don't know why. Environmental groups included, except for some, have dropped the ball on saying, this is not the Paris target. This is Harper's target. It's inconsistent with Paris, and targets actually do matter. The reason we haven't hit targets in the past is we weren't aiming for them. The only good climate plan we have had in this country was the one brought in 2005 when Paul Martin was in a minority government, and it was detailed and it was fully funded, and it would have gotten us very close to Kyoto. And I have no doubt that it would have been implemented had the government not fallen and Harper come in that 2006 election. We have used targets in the past. Targets work. We use targets to reduce ozone depleting substances. We use targets to reduce sulfur dioxide to fight acid rain. It's not that targets don't work. It's that when there's no political will from the top to meet the targets, it just becomes an exercise in unaccountability, because the target deadline is always outside the political lifespan of the political party or leader who made it. So we need a near-term target for 2025. The planet needs countries like Canada that claim to care about climate to actually show some leadership. When we are such laggards as we are, we give space for other countries to do less. If the Green Party plan, which was called Mission Possible, and it's still findable on our website, broke down chapter and verse, megaton by megaton, how we could get to 60% cuts below 2005 levels by 2030. We were serious. We didn't just make a promise out of the thin air. We worked hard on developing this, and we had it peer reviewed by other climate experts. It's not easy. No one would say it was easy, but it's doable. Fighting COVID isn't easy. The pandemic shutting down our economies, we did that because we understood it was an emergency. So I would say for action items, one that I don't want people to miss is educate the media. The national, no, it's important.
No,
We
I agree.
write letters to the editor. When you hear a reporter say something, and these days, well, if you get, it's a little bit easier for me. I end up direct messaging a lot of reporters because they follow me, so I can send them a direct message on Twitter. Correct errors. Some of you are in a position to do that. Reporters don't want to make errors, but I really feel as though if you go back to 1990, some of us on this call are old enough to remember when the CBC dedicated resources to a science reporter. Remember Eve Savory? Eve knew her stuff. You wouldn't get Eve Savory making a mistake of not knowing the difference between avoiding 2 degrees Celsius and 2%, right? Well, Rosie Barton doesn't know the difference. She asked the head of the United Nations Environment Program if he really thought anyone could hit the 2%. I shouldn't say these things out loud, but we have to educate our news media, because even the ones who mean well, it's as if the business pages in the Globe and Mail had a bunch of reporters who didn't understand inflation. You wouldn't let that happen if you ran, but they are prepared to accept a level of a failure to understand the basics, such that you get Paul Wells writing a piece. Justin Trudeau is all in on climate because they're going to raise the carbon tax to $170 a ton by 2030, without evidence that $170 a ton by 2030 actually meets the goals of the IPCC. It's a good thing to do, just like eco-energy retrofits. These are good things to do. But unless you've crunched the numbers and they get you to substantial reductions below 1990 levels, to the extent that you actually can do what the IPCC says we must do and avoid going above 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We've got about 15 minutes to go. Rolly's going to read some questions from viewers. And then after that, Rolly is going to tell us about next week's Zoom, which will be Thursday at 1. So over to you, Rolly, and thank you both for my section.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yes, I have a question from Peter Boyle. And actually, it's more of a comment by Peter than a question, but he says that a meeting this week by a Lead Now group with a member of the cabinet, the cabinet minister would apparently have said that changing the milestone year will not be considered. 2030 is fixed. Now, this, in the past week, I guess, I was a member of a lobbying group, Citizens Climate Lobbying Group, We lobbied a liberal and we lobbied a conservative. And will not mention any names, of course, but the impression that some of us got from the liberal MP was that there might be some opening to to adding a reference to 2025. Now, I didn't say making it a firm target, but adding a reference to 2025. So I guess my question, or I think Peter's question and mine as well, is to Elizabeth. Do you have a sense, Elizabeth, that there's that the Liberals might have made this document so benign, the C12, that it will welcome or accept, modifications to C12 in order to survive politically? I mean, how is this going to play out when it goes to committee?
Yeah, well, the timing is also an important question here. Can this possibly pass the House of Commons and the Senate if there's a spring election? The answer is no. So why is the legislation, as Ken Love has pointed out, so thin that you think it's a private member's bill when you're looking at it? Was it intended to pass to be law, or is it intended to be a check mark against the platform of the Liberals in 2019 without people really examining whether it makes the difference? With the lack of information and level of being willfully uninformed that permeates our national media, they'll likely get away with this. So I think, yes, there will be changes. I don't doubt for 1 minute that Wilkinson is serious when he says we will entertain your amendments and send them. I've sent in draft amendments, and we are going to, of course, have to get them through the legal drafters and present them. And but if there's no willingness on the part of the government to put in a milestone year of 2025 with an actual commitment to reducing by, you can almost pick any number. I'd rather it was a real number, like 30% or 25% below 2005 levels by 2025. The way the legislation works, they have to give an update 2 years before you hit a milestone year. Now that happens then, of course, to be 2023. And people who are super engaged with the Paris Agreement will remember that 2023 is the first year under Paris that we have a global moment of where are we. It's called, in the terms of the agreement, a global stock take. So taking stock of where we are. Are we collectively on track to mass extinction at the moment? Yes. Or are we collectively on track to saving future generations, our children? Not even future, current living people who are smaller than us. Are we on track to save them or not? That first moment is 2023. So it'd be highly advantageous in Canada's preparations for international discussion to make 2025 the first milestone year, such that we're ready in 2023 to participate in a discussion of where are we? Where are we? My hope right now is that John Kerry, I have to say, I looked at his first Twitter post that he's now tweeting as at climate something. We should figure out what he is tweeting as, John Kerry. But what I loved was he put his bio photo up, and it's the moment when I don't want to. This is terrible. I'm getting emotional. It's the moment when he pulled his granddaughter on his lap. So on behalf of the Obama administration and the U.S. government, he signed the Paris Agreement on Earth Day on the floor of the United Nations with his granddaughter on his lap, which means he understands that we don't have time. And I'm sorry. I have more hope in what may come from John Kerry being on a national security advisory team to Joe Biden. Although I don't really trust any politicians, I'm sure Joe Biden has to ban fracking. Will he? We have to ban fracking. Will we? We seem to be unhinged from the reality of the moment, which is that the climate crisis threatens us far more than COVID. And yet we're cowardly in the face of fossil fuel lobbies.
Really?
Thank you for sharing those emotions, because I too saw that moment when I think he tweeted it, or when John Kerry signed with his granddaughter, in his sort of holding her on the side like this. And that is a very, very touching post. There's no doubt about it. Seth Klein has shared a link to the 350.org petition regarding C12. I've shared the link regarding the Lead Now petition. Now, Lead Now is looking to get 14,000 signatures. I think they have close to 12,000 right now. This is only a couple of days ago. I saw, well, no, sorry, close to about 11,000. This is only a couple of days ago. So, I mean, I know petitions perhaps are a good gauge of the public interest out there, but one question, I think it's Ann Carey that was asking is, how can we get the broader public involved? And of course, you mentioned, Elizabeth, that there's a need to educate the media. And so, yeah, how do we get the broader public involved? Because 14,000 signatures is a good number. But there are millions and millions of Canadians who also are concerned about climate change. So how do we get that mobilization? And I think that Seth Klein's A Good War, if I can put a plug for that book, is I wish every Canadian could read it. As great ideas, but is this government at all considering educating the broader public or not?
I'd like to have them educate themselves first. I think there is a desperate need for, and I'm serious, a desperate need for a top-notch science briefing for the whole cabinet. Desperate need. And I also look at these things and what happened to the structure. I mean, I worked in Environment Canada. I mean, I learned my climate science from Environment Canada scientists in 1986 when I was senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment. In those days, Environment Canada was a robust department with deep science intelligence, deep knowledge of many fields. And it wasn't all Harper by any means. Early, the growth of whenever a managerial culture, the neoliberalism and the notion that government doesn't do anything as well as the private sector. Our civil service began to be managed with the notion that you could be working as a scientist in DFO one day and be in Veterans Affairs the next. That you could promote people through the civil service ranks who were really not content specialists in the department where they worked. So like if you're a good brain surgeon one day, tomorrow you're doing dentistry. So we've dumbed down the capacity of every single department, by the way. But meanwhile, then Harper hit. So then you have a lot of good scientists leaving Environment Canada. What was the point? And you had lots of cuts. Now, this is something that didn't get covered again, but this is something the media should have been able to cover because it's the kind of stuff they understand. But there was never any effort since 2015 with either Catherine McKenna or Jonathan Wilkinson to replenish core scientific capacity. I remember arguing, I'll say his name, he's chief of staff to the Minister of Environment, Marlo Reynolds, used to be at Pembina, a sort of environmental group that also does a lot of industry consulting work. Pembina is a good bunch. But anyway, Marlo, I was arguing with him at the point that the pink slips were going out for the very last of the science in climate that was being funded, left over from when Jean Chrétien started a really big climate science funding program. And Marlo said, no. I said, wait, the science, this group, that's the Climate Forum that was then being run by Professor Tom Peterson from out here at University of Victoria. So this is it. The pink slips are going out. When are you have to fund climate science? And he said, oh, we don't have to do that. I'll never forget Marlo Reynolds. He said, we don't have to fund climate science. We believe in climate science. We don't deny it. We've got our science. Well, they need they need to bring in some people from outside. From University of Toronto, bring in Richard Peltier, get him to explain what happens if we lose the Western Antarctic ice sheet, get him to explain that to cabinet. Or bring in Catherine Hayhoe, get her to explain what unstoppable, self-accelerating global warming looks like. They need a science briefing. So do all the people in the press gallery. So do the Canadians in general are more on board for real climate action than the political leadership federally or provincially.
Ken, do you have anything to say about that?
Not on that per se, but I don't know how long we have to talk about Bill C12. And one thing that I think has been left out so far is in terms of advocacy, where it is. It's in second reading. They were going to finish second reading. It looked like back in very late November. From what I hear talking to an MP, he explained to me that, well, sometimes when more MPs want to talk about it, they need more time. But at the same time, Mr. Wilkinson has said, and a Liberal MP has confirmed, he wants to get it to committee as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Now, once it goes to committee, in terms of advocacy with our MPs, we turn into pumpkins. It's pretty much out of the hands of MPs. The committee has a time where they listen to public submissions. That's a little more complicated, but you can all make public submissions in writing. They pick a few maybe to hear in person, but then the committee sort of closes down and they make their own decision and they give their own advice on amendments. So we need to talk to our MPs before it goes to committee. And once committee finishes hearing public submission, game over. Sit back and wait till what they do. So it's now, between now and maybe the first week of February. That's when we need to talk to our MPs.
And I think if I could just say in this window, Ken's right. Of course, first of all, second reading has a required minimum amount of time unless they apply that they're going to bring closure in. What really delayed us was the Conservatives dragged out, essentially almost like a filibuster, but not quite an official filibuster, but they really dragged out the medical assistance in dying bill such that we didn't get to a number of pieces of legislation that I know the Liberal House Leader had wanted us to vote on before Christmas break. So we're looking forward to a chance to have at least the Green Party view of the bill put on the record in second reading debate. Other than in questions and comments, we haven't been able to do that yet. At the moment, based on the debates we had before Christmas, it appears that the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP will all vote for the bill at second reading to send it to committee. Paul Manley, Jenica Atwin, and I make our decisions by consensus. We're still talking about how we think we're going to vote at second reading. We clearly want to put forward amendments in committee, and we will, but we're not allowed to be members of the committee. But there's a very complicated thing that they've done to deny us rights that we would otherwise have. They deem our amendments to have been put forward, but we can only speak to them for 60 seconds in committee. But committee, the big picture politics here needs to be stressed. If the Liberals feel vulnerable, that C12 is weak, if they feel exposed, that their climate plan with the fictitious year that they have to reduce against something we've never hit of 815 megatons, when in 2005 we were at 730 megatons, and Harper committed us to reduce that by 30%. Okay, we have not reduced at all. Basically, we're at the same place where we were in 2005, which is why they want to use this fictitious starting point of 815, claiming that's where we would be, but for all their wonderful efforts. We need a plan and we need a bill that work. We have neither. And that's something that if we got that into the media, if environmental groups and if the Liberals felt, okay, because I think there are a lot of good people in that government, for sure, a lot of people who actually think their bill is good think that because they don't know what we're talking about right here. They don't hear that the IPCC report is what should be driving them, that they should hold to 1.5 degrees, that the window on 1.5 closes and closes forever soon. I think they actually believe that getting to net zero by 2050 will actually save the future generations and their own children. The twisting of that science, I think, had to have been done by people within the bureaucracy at Environment Canada, the Harperites who got left there. So it's tricky, but if we can get enough political exposure soon, the Liberals could improve this bill, improve the target, and go into the next election looking like and actually being climate leaders. And I would vastly prefer that than being able to take them apart for hypocrisy and failure.
Thank you. Elizabeth, could I just say, Ken Johnson, do you have the link for making submissions to the Environment Committee? Could you post that?
We have the email addresses, everyone. I will email it out to everyone.
And it's
Both
also
that and the
asking to be a witness. If you have expertise, you should ask to present to the committee. All the hearings are by Zoom. No one has to fly to Ottawa anymore. And only official members of the committee can put forward requests for witnesses, but submissions can be sent in all kinds of ways to the clerk of the committee. And
Well, yeah.
Tanya
Sorry.
Gill, somebody's asked us where we get access to the numbers I was giving you. The Environment Canada website, you go to what they call their climate plan, which again, they still think it's an environmental issue. They don't get that it's a security threat. So it's called Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy, or Healthy Economy, Healthy Environment, something like that. You Google that on the Environment Canada website and go to all the attachments. You have to dig fairly deep to figure out that they're using 815 megatons as the starting point instead of 730 megatons, which were our actual emissions in 2005.
But also, I just went to Environment Committee and actually got the address of the email address of the Environment Committee and wrote to them. And they wrote back the next day and sent me all the links. But unfortunately, we can't get them up now. But you can do that too, listeners. Just Google and dig.
Kathleen, just a reminder that we're at 2:04, if you're not watching the time.
Do we still have quite a few people on? Are there a couple of questions you want to ask, or should we close? How are you both doing, guests? Elizabeth?
I'm so sorry that I was late, and I'm so sorry I started crying in the middle of this. I'm just very sorry, everybody. But I know there's 45 participants still there, and I'm good to stay on a little longer if anyone has questions.
Well, first of all, it was not your fault that you were late, so we'll get that on the record.
That's true.
And it's not your fault that you were crying. It's a cryable occasion. So, okay, Rolly, more questions?
I think we've covered most of the questions in one way or another. Elizabeth has just given how to access the information regarding the 815 tons.
Yeah, I'm hoping to be able to post soon. We have a really good critique done by a former Green Party candidate, Walter Bauer, who's a professional, who's a former retired engineer. He did a super job going through the plan, for which I'm grateful because I've been focusing so much on C12. I'd make another point that we haven't covered yet here, which is this question of multi-stakeholder panel for advice versus expert panel. I just want to make a pitch. One of the things that we could be pointing out and that I'm trying to point out to them is it's a terrible thing that Stephen Harper killed the National Roundtable for the Environment and Economy. It was killed in the omnibus budget bill, Bill C-38, in the spring of 2012, the one that was 400 pages long and destroyed our environmental assessment process, et cetera, et cetera. But this is not the place for a multi-stakeholder group. The Climate Accountability Act is where you need an expert group. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't revive the National Roundtable on Environment Economy and ask them to be as the Auditor General in the Environment Commissioner office. The Environment Commissioner has made it very clear to every government and has worked with the Auditors General in every province that the Auditors General of Canada will be auditing every government on the SDG goals, Sustainable Development Goals, which include ocean plastics, include marine protection, include ending poverty. The SDG goals should be routinely reviewed, and I think we need to bring back the National Roundtable on Environment Economy to bring back that multi-stakeholder lens on all our SDG goals. But this panel, and one of my specific amendments is just insert the word expert every time it says advisory panel. Expert advisory panel, drawn from climate scientists. And if they're there to provide advice for how we meet our targets, sure, bring in people who are experts in renewable energy and eco-efficiency. I know that the NDP member of the committee has said, well, and raised this in the House, will the government commit that no oil industry executives are on the panel? I know where she's coming from. It's a good thought, but it isn't going to sell that this is, I don't want it to be a multi-stakeholder group even if we keep out the oil industry executives, it creates the kind of conversation that suggests that you're going to get to a consensus decision of where our target should be. We don't need that to be by consensus. It's like we were told very clearly by the IPCC what needs to be done to hold to 1.5 degrees. That's not debatable. That's not negotiable. What we need is to make sure that that panel is expert. And what the UK did is it created an entire new climate agency that's widely respected, that's got great expertise, and that knows how to do carbon budgeting. That's what's needed here, and that's what's missing. And of course, yeah, 2025. Yeah.
Elizabeth, could you just give a couple of lines about carbon budgeting as opposed to a target? I mean,
Well, carbon budgeting relates to a target. They're not different concepts, really. It's just that if you look at the global carbon budget, there's only so many megatons of well, there's only so. This is back up and say, when the International Energy Agency first said, if you're going to avoid runaway global warming, a lot of carbon has to be left in the ground. That's based on budgeting, saying, okay, how much can we burn? And if we burn all the fossil fuel reserves we know about, game over. Forget about human civilization. I mean, forget about whether, there's a point at which the worst case scenario on climate, which no one wants to talk about, is extinction. Human extinction, basically all mammal species, insects, there's some insects that'll do all right, but we don't talk about it because it shouldn't happen. It doesn't have to happen. We're not on track to that happening if we act, right? If we act soon. So that's where carbon budgeting comes in. And the best way to understand carbon budgeting, if you're looking for something quick you can Google, is Bill McKibben's article from Rolling Stone from a few years ago called "Do the Math." Just do the math, right? So go back to that one because it's easy to find. But what you want to do is in 5-year increments. Say, okay, this year, well, the last year for which we have records, because Canada is very poor at reporting and very poor at timely reporting. So for timely reporting, the last year for which we have records was 2018. So in 2018, Canada emitted 729 megatons of carbon, not counting forest fires, right? Not counting other land use emissions, not counting methane from melting permafrost. But what we count, what we measure is 729 megatons. Okay. So if we're going to be reducing, we can say, okay, well, what's left in the carbon budget for Canada? Well, basically nothing. So we've got to start. The carbon budget globally kind of runs out in 7 years. So you can say, okay, in this year we know we have to reduce by X number of megatons. Where do we get that? Well, let's get all the carbon out of our electricity grid. Let's make sure transportation has no carbon in it. We move more rapidly to electric vehicles. We need to improve. The east-west electricity grid has tons of work that needs to be done, and that takes a few years of lead time because your interties aren't easy to build. And certainly we're not going to say, well, we're going to force through a line between eastern Manitoba and western Ontario and ignore the fact that it's Indigenous lands and boreal forests. These things have lead time, and you need to route and site with Indigenous sovereignty in mind. It's not going to be happening like that. We got to work fast and work hard and not do these teeny little incremental things that add up to being a list of good things the Liberals are prepared to do. And then they're not willing to stop the list of bad things they're prepared to do. That way they're perfectly balanced to never achieve anything. But when you budget your 5-year increments, whether it's by targets or by megatons, what you're really saying is the atmosphere is boss. Atmospheric chemistry is boss. We don't get to negotiate with the atmosphere. There's only so much room left. And we have to accommodate our conduct to science. It's like saying, it was like when Theresa Tam said you have to stand 6 feet apart. Okay, nobody in the cabinet that I know of said you have to explain to that Theresa Tam we can only stand 3 feet apart. She's being unreasonable. And anyway, the Conservatives would only make us stay 6 inches apart. So no one should complain that we're only going to give you your 3 feet. I mean, that's the equivalent message we're getting as climate activists on where the government is on climate science is, yeah, come on, Theresa Tam, you can't be real. 6 feet, give me a break. That's the problem. They don't understand the climate science as being as absolutely firm and non-negotiable as they understand the public health advice on COVID.
Thanks. Rolly, any more? Or do you think you should do your,
Well, actually, there are a lot of questions adding up, and I suggest that
Oh.
perhaps we, in an email, try to answer some of those questions. Also, the request about regarding where people can access the webinar. There's a suggestion that we post it on the Green Party Slack channel. First of all, is there any problem, Elizabeth or Ken, recording this or sharing the recording of this video?
I don't have any problem. I put my personal email address in the chat. I can send people all the papers I'm dealing with. I'm not sure how to put anything on things. But if somebody wants to tell me how to put things on the Green Party Slack channel, I suppose I can figure it out, or somebody. But what I really want to have done, and we're working on it, is to have a section of the Green Party of Canada website, just as we do now on Mission Possible. You can find all of our data on how to cut 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. I'd like to build out a kind of a toolkit for where we are now in terms of the newly announced so-called plan, which I would call the wish list, and it was the one announced December 11th of 2020, and a deeper analysis on C12 for people to access that. So that's to come fairly soon. For the oh, thanks, Peter, for the rest of the participants and observers in today's meeting. Feel free to send me an email. That's my personal email address, and I'll send you the paper. It's not a public paper yet. I haven't gotten sign off to put it up on the website, and it sure isn't user friendly. I mean, it's techie and wonky. So we do need to make some. I would love help, by the way, and Seth knows I'm trying to figure out how do we communicate to people. This is the key fallacy of net zero by 2050. And it's one that we're experiencing globally in the mania of many governments, which initially I was over the moon as soon as governments started saying net zero by 2050, net zero by 2050, fantastic. But if you leave out what you do in the next 10 years, it's irrelevant. And I'm trying to figure out how do we explain to people, I'd love help with this, that even though it's true that the IPCC says if we're at 1.5 degrees by 2050, that will imply we've achieved net zero. What they did not say was that if we get to net zero by 2050, so suppose we wait and at 2040 we panic and shut down everything and we're at net zero by 2050. Have we held to 1.5? No, we could be at 3 or 4 or 5 because the window on 1.5 closes in this decade. I mean, I keep thinking, I have very bad metaphors. They're not going to work. Like if you're drowning, you'd like your body on dry land next week. However, if you drowned and you get your body to dry land later, it doesn't help you. I don't have the right communication soundbite to explain this to people yet, because the fallacy is hard to describe.
It's a bit, Elizabeth, it would be a bit like just saying by 2024 we're going to be finished with COVID. We'll have 0 COVID cases, but then not doing anything now about it because we know we got 3 years before we're going to get there. Some crazy thing.
That's good. That's good. I mean, it's a work in progress. I'm communicating this stuff, especially when you have a wall of media and most environmental groups, particularly the bigger national ones, who are so celebratory about what the Liberals are doing. And I'm not partisan about this. I would be over the moon if they actually started to do real climate action such that there would be no space in a political debate for the Green Party to add anything. Great. but we're not there.
No.
Elizabeth,
I've
there were,
even,
You people said you wanted to get our permission to put it online. I'm not going to give it unless you answer or you let me say something about C12 and the targets and the budgets.
okay, go ahead.
A budget, UK and New Zealand do it. They say between now and let's say 2025, we can only emit so much GHGs. We say we don't, but let's say 2025, we have a number. We've promised the number isn't big enough. You know, we got to get it down to 511 by 2030. Half the way there for our Paris targets, it would be 620 in 2025. So instead of saying between now and 2025, we get to emit so much, we're saying in 2025, we can only emit 620. It's a bit like six to one, half a dozen the other. Budgets are better, but I don't think it's worth killing C12 over not having budgets because it's roughly the same. One of the beauties of a budget is that they say right in their rules, UK, New Zealand, if you don't make the budget, Minister, you have to explain how you're going to take it out of the next budget. We can't do that. We might be able to say, well, you didn't make the target, now you got to reduce the next target. But among the reasons to kill C12, I don't think that's one of them. Like I said, I don't think it makes the top 4 problems. It might be 5 or 6 or 7. So now you can put the video up. It's all right with me.
And
Thank you, thank you.
well, I want to mention something that New Zealand is doing, which is very clever, and I have shared this with the Ministry of Environment. The Minister of Climate for New Zealand is James Shaw. He's the co-leader of the New Zealand Greens, so we have a long-standing friendship. They're working to have their finance minister book on the books of the government of New Zealand a contingent liability with the presumption that if New Zealand were to miss a target for domestic reductions, they would have to buy offsets on the international market. And offsets aren't bad in themselves. If you're sure you've brought a fraud-proof offset, if you're able to say, for instance, shut down a coal plant in South Africa and fund their use of solar so that you can shut down that coal plant, the atmosphere doesn't care where the carbon's coming from. The point is to shut it down. But if the government of New Zealand, again, in a future government, right, say the government changes, Jacinda Ardern, I mean, I don't want, we love Jacinda Ardern, but suppose Labor loses and someone else comes in. If the Department of Finance has on the books a contingent liability that falls due if you miss your targets, that is an important enforcement mechanism that will transcend changes of political power. So it's very hard to have a good mechanisms where the world is developing them. There's a center at Columbia University, the Sabin Center in Climate Law. I've asked them to review C12 and give us a report and be prepared to testify to our committee, because I know, as Ken knows, you compare it to any other climate accountability law around the world, it's thin. It's yeah, but that's the question of what does the government have to do. What I propose for the legislation in the short term is just to say, if we don't hit our target, the minister, well, first of all, it should say somewhere in the bill, Canada must hit the target. Right? The minister must hit the target. Because what it says now is, if the minister doesn't hit the target, the minister must explain. So if you have a mandatory duty, the minister shall hit the target. The government shall hit the target. Then you create at least some possibility of legal action, because if it's a mandatory duty, you can go for an order in the nature of mandamus to say, well, the government must hit that target. The courts are unlikely to enforce it, but at least it becomes more than, I mean, what it is now is a bit laughable. The Accountability Act is that if you don't hit the target, you have to explain.
In fact, the New Zealand Act has a section, it's kind of elegantly drafted. It says no court actions unless it's in the way set out in this section. And then it says anybody can bring an action for a court order, a declaration saying that the minister didn't make the target or the minister is not on track to meet the target. And the only teeth that order has is that the minister has to trot into Parliament, rather shamefacedly, I'm sure, with this order saying this is the order the court made against me and provide an explanation. And the people who brought the action get costs. But they're the only ones that explicitly set out a means to a court action. There's been one that I know of by a group called Plan B in Britain under the UK Act. They were dismissed both at the trial or application level and at appeal. So it's tough to know whether, court is going to work very well. In fact, that's the one reason. I thought that was going to be the main interesting point, the main issue in C12. I thought they'd cover off all the rest, as they did in New Zealand and UK. I don't think I would have been nearly as excited about C12 if, in fact, that was the only issue. The rest of it is just so shameful that that's why it's piqued my interest.
Rolly has to go in a few minutes. We'd like him to have a chance to describe or tell us about next week. Fire your fossil bank, because there's going to be a National Day of Action on Friday. So we'll have this Zoom on Thursday.
Thank you, Kathleen, for this opportunity. Yes, the next Zoom series session will be roughly a week from now. And I've become very passionate about how the big banks are financing the climate crisis this year. So I'm involved in a campaign and a National Action Day, sort of leading a group that will have a National Action Day in Canada on January 29th. And what drives what motivates me is finding out things like Canada's 5 big banks since 2016, since the Paris Agreement, have financed globally globally $641 billion of fossil fuel projects. And in Canada, our big 5 are 70% of the financiers for the tar sands expansion, a total of about 100 billion. So the banks have a huge role to play, and next week we will have another Zoom session, where I'll talk at length about the plan for Friday the 29th. So the target bank is RBC. It is the worst of the 5, but the other 4 are just as bad. So Canadians have to start asking how their bank is using their money, because and once you find the answer to that, you need to do something about it. So that's what the Fire Your Fossil Bank webinar will be about next week. I hope to see you there. I have to go. I have another commitment at 2:30. Thank you all. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Elizabeth. As always, you've brought so much, valid information and to this group. And
Thank you.
I particularly enjoyed when you got emotional. I don't know why, but I just did.
Well, I'm a grandmother too, and I can't understand how. And I think it's only by not understanding the science. So I'm willing to give all kinds of benefit of the doubt to people about whom I should now be much more cynical. I'm willing to believe that if Justin Trudeau and Jonathan Wilkinson actually understood the IPCC 1.5 degree report, they would not be doing what they're doing. And I think that for that, again, education. And I really love some of the I know all the people who've been panelists and participants, and in the chat, there's a lot of great ideas. And I just urge everybody to do everything you can to explain how urgent the situation is. We can't be building new pipelines. We can't be fracking. We have bright new economic opportunities in renewable energy and energy efficiency. And it's just a crying shame that we aren't, you know, I wish it had been like a game of poker, so that when Joe Biden said, well, we're canceling Keystone, Justin Trudeau could have said, yep, we'll see you and raise you one. We're canceling Trans Mountain. I mean, that's the kind of conversation we should be having, right?
Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth and Ken.
If I
Ken
may,
Love, Ken Love. For
if I may, there was a
participating.
question that somebody wanted me to go over, summarize the asks I have. I don't think I should do it because you want to end the call, but can I put my email on there too? It's love.
Sure.
At simpatico.ca. I think it was Betty DeGroot asked the question. I started to type it with my email and I hit return like I always do. So all you got is Ms. DeGroot. It's anyway, love.lee@simpatico.ca. And if you're really excited by this and you have a lot of endurance, you can watch my video. Otherwise, I'm pleased to respond by an email.
Ken, why don't you just tell them quickly tell them your asks.
Well, because then I have to look at my notes again.
Oh, well, I think we're pretty well. We've gone an hour and a half. And
I'm afraid I
Elizabeth has
have to go.
Yeah.
But I thank you for figuring out the technical glitch, because this is the first time ever in this whole year of COVID, first Zoom meeting that didn't want to let me in. So,
so
glad
near
we
and yet
solved
so
that.
far.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Ken Johnson, and everybody at below 2 degrees. I think you're below 2 degrees as a group. I want to hold to 1.5, but thank you very much for holding this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. You were great.
Oh, thanks. Bye.
Thank you too. I enjoyed this. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ken.